In 1969, I left my pursuit of an electrical engineering degree at Rice University to go to Florida Christian College in Tampa, Florida. I had become involved in a congregation outside of Houston and inspired by the gospel preacher that preached there and studied with me, decided that the world needed more preachers, not more electrical engineers. And so I went to Florida Christian College, learned many years later that I was following in the steps of a number of other men who have been faculty members here and one or two who still are, who also attended Florida Christian College. My very first semester there, one of our instructors announced during chapel that during the lunch hour, he was going to be showing slides from his recent trip to the Holy Land. His name was Farrell Jenkins. One of our professors there went on to be a dean and other administrative roles, and now retired from the school but still alive. And so I attended that. And my view of the Bible and how I should teach it changed that day. Because I came to Florida Christian College to learn how to study the Bible and teach the Bible. But after that one presentation, I realized to do that well, I needed to know the land of the Bible as well. And so for all the years from that time until this year, I did everything I could to learn more about the land, or more properly actually, the lands of the Bible. On lots of books in my library, have watched many documentaries, attended all the presentations when brothers had gone over there and come back and were presenting about that. And then after 47 years, I got a phone call from Dr. Jesse Long over at Lubbock Christian University, and he told me that someone had anonymously given the funds for me to actually go there. And so over the spring break this year in March, I, along with 21 others associated with Lubbock Christian University, went to what is often called the Holy Land, or as Dr. Long calls it, the land of the Holy One. So I want to take a few moments this morning to hopefully inspire you to see what I saw that day in 1969 when I saw that slide presentation. That was before PowerPoint, before the internet, before computers. Dr. Jenkins just had his 35 millimeter slides and a slide projector. But it was more than enough to set me on a path that has served me well, I think also God's church all the years since then. Why do we need to know more about the land of the Bible? Let me give you quickly several reasons why. Number one, it is the land that God chose to play out the scheme of redemption. It is the land that God chose to play out the biblical story. He could have chosen Australia. He could have chosen Florida. He could have chosen West Texas in whatever shape it was in 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. But He chose this land. We don't question His wisdom. Instead, we ought to appreciate it. Not only did He choose this land to play out the biblical story, the scheme of redemption, He chose this land to send His own Son, God incarnate, to be born there, to grow up there, to minister there, to die there, to be buried there, to be raised from the dead there, and to begin His church there. As the song we sang at the beginning clearly indicates, this land, often called the whole land Zion, Israel, is and was a type and a foreshadowing of the eternal land that all of us are looking forward to spending all eternity with God there. But God called this place the foreshadowing. What is there about this land? What is there about this place that God would choose it and say it is a type, a kind of the heavenly land? That's one reason. Secondly, it is a place where the great heroes of faith of the Scriptures lived. And as their stories play out, the better we understand the place where they lived and what those places were like, as much as we can know at this date and time, the better we'll understand the biblical story. And then number 3 is, I call this one, the stones still speak. You know, when they crossed the Jordan into the promised land under Joshua, as soon as they'd gotten onto the west bank of the Jordan, Joshua sent men back down into the riverbed to pick up stones and to build a monument there on the west bank of the Jordan, so that in future times when people saw that monument, that marker that they put there, that stack of stones would be speaking to them about what happened here. Well, that stack of stones are not there anymore. Nor are any of the many other monuments that we read about in the Scriptures that they would put up for the same purpose. But there are still stones there, and those stones are still speaking. And it provides not only a message for us, but it even provides a message for the unbeliever that this happened in a real place with real people. These are real events. You watch the movies, the Lord of the Rings, you read the books, or you watch the movies of Harry Potter, many other popular fantasy stories. And while they're very entertaining, you'll never find any of those places on a map anywhere. There'll never be any stones found that mark where once that city stood. Because, after all, they're not real. But when you see the stones in the land where the great men and women of the Bible lived and walked and served God, they testify that this is a real place. And what you see there today accords very much with what we read in the biblical story of what it was like. We had the opportunity, while we were there, 9.5 days in country between Israel and Jordan, to visit some 24 different areas of the country. I don't expect you to make out what's on this map here, but those are the places. Obviously, we were all over. We were getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and getting on a bus as soon as we could get dressed and eat, and rolling in at 8 o'clock or 8:30 at night at the next hotel to spend the night. Because Dr. Long usually does this in the summertime, and he has 14 days, but this time we only had 9.5, but we didn't miss a place. And as we went to those different places, and in some of them there were multiple sites to be seen, some 40 different historical sites, most of them mentioned in the pages of Scripture or implied, if not mentioned. It was such an eye-opening experience for every one of us that were a part of that group. They reminded us that there are two kinds of people that come to the Holy Land, as it's often called. There are those who are tourists, who come to see, and so they can say later, I saw. And then there are those who are pilgrims, those who come to see so they can be changed. And I know that was true of our group. Most of us were older. In fact, I would say a good half of the group was older than I am. And I'm 68 years old, and it was their first time. They were elders, Bible teachers, servants in the body of Christ, gospel preachers, and they, like me, could have never imagined what a difference it made, even though they had often, like I, dreamed of doing it for most of their life. So I want to quickly present to you this morning just 3 places out of those 40 that we visited, just so you can see a little bit and understand a little bit about why it would make a difference to someone like me. The first of those places is a place called Tel Dan. Tel Dan is located way up in the north of what was ancient Israel. It has a very interesting story. If you follow it through the scriptures, it's first mentioned actually with Abraham when he was pursuing those who had captured his nephew and others. They pursued them all the way, it says, up to Dan. Of course, a later writer is writing back about what Abraham did. In Abraham's day, it probably wasn't called Dan yet. Almost surely it wasn't. It was called Laish. But it was a city even in the days of Abraham. But then when the children of Israel came into the land of Canaan under Joshua, the Danites were given a piece of property along the Mediterranean. But because they were afraid or unable to take it away from the Philistines, they decided to move. And they discovered that way up at the top of the land that belonged to the Israelites was a peaceful city that no one had claimed, and so they marched on it and captured it and took it over. And that turned out to be a very bad sign of what was to come. Because after the kingdom was set up under Saul, then David, then Solomon, and then when it divided and the northern kingdom was formed under King Jeroboam, Jeroboam chose Dan as one of the two places where he set up a golden calf, a calf idol for people to worship. And so for some 200 years, those who had formerly worshipped Jehovah God worshipped a calf at Dan and at Bethel instead. And that's the story of the Scriptures. But what many people don't know is that the place where they worshipped is still there today, 2,700 years later. To get there, you end up having to go through the Dan National Reserve. It's a beautiful area. I had no idea, like most of Israel, how beautiful so many parts of that land end. It's lush, it's beautiful, hilly, hardly a flat spot anywhere in the whole country. But as we went through there, we had to travel through some dense underbrush. It wasn't set up at all like Disneyland where everything's already been pre-planned for you. You actually are hiking and traveling through there, and we come past the Dan River. This is one of the three rivers that ends up forming the Jordan River. Did I know that? No, I should have. I could go read it in a book somewhere. But it's far different when you actually see it and see how much water is pouring out of the springs that form the headwaters for the Dan River that ends up being a part of the Jordan River. And walking through the dense underbrush, seeing wild fig trees growing and all sorts of other trees, olives, and then many I didn't recognize. At last, suddenly we come out into an opening. And there is our guide pointing out to us that we have come to the place where the calf idol had once been set up. Seeing in this picture here, the area where the priest apparently lived and where preparations of sacrifices and other things would be made. This is all that's left, just the lower part of the walls of the buildings that they would have lived in. And then you look a little bit to the right and you see in this picture to the right of it is where the huge altar of sacrifice would have stood. The wall that surrounded it is still there. The altar itself is mostly missing now. Then to the left, the higher platform is where the idol itself would have stood. And then as we walked around that, we could see how ornate the stones were, how much effort was put into it by those ancients to build up this place where they worshiped something that wasn't even God. The stones are well dressed, even after 2,700 years, still fit together perfectly well. Move around to the other side and you get a better picture of it. Now the place of the altar is to the left, the place of the calf is to the right. And it's on top of this hill that now is called by archaeologists Tel Dan. Tel is a hill on which there's archaeological discoveries that have been made and probably many more to be made. And it's only one of three significant sites that are located on this hill. But this one really stood out to me because right now where I preach, we're studying through the prophets of the Old Testament. And particularly in Hosea. Hosea several times talks about that the calf idols of Samaria is the reason why God was going to allow them to be destroyed as a nation and carried into captivity. And I guess maybe it's just plain old superstition, but I finally decided I would not even step up on top of the platform. I didn't want to get that close. To know that that's a place where people once worshiped something they substituted for God Himself. Here's Dr. Long talking to us about what we're seeing there and explaining things. But our own eyes were telling us even things he was not telling us. Here's our group standing in front of where the ancient altar was. Now they just have a metal frame to mark the place where it probably stood. But to know that for over 200 years, people worship this God here instead of the real God. And to realize that people still do that today. It may not be made like a calf, but it's probably still made out of gold. This was Tel Dan. Then the next day, we had the opportunity to go to Capernaum. This is a New Testament site. It's not even mentioned in the Old Testament. We probably existed as a small fishing village, but by New Testament times it had grown some in size. As I looked quickly through the scriptures last night about Capernaum, I reminded myself that it's located there on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. That it wasn't until the 1800s that the place was even located again. It had been buried for at least since before the time of the Crusades. Much of it had been destroyed around 746 AD by a big earthquake, and it just never was rebuilt. Maybe a little fishing village right down on the shore where fishermen could put in and so forth, but nothing like the town it was in Jesus' day. And yet in Matthew 9:1, Jesus called it is called by Matthew rather, as Jesus' own city, because it's a place where Jesus chose to have the center of His ministry. And it's the place where, nearby at least, He called many of His disciples to be His disciples. James and John and Peter and Andrew and the others. We know that Peter had a home there. It tells us that in the Scriptures. It tells us in Luke 7:5 that there was a synagogue there that had been built by a Roman centurion for the Jewish community that was located there, which is a very unusual thing. A man that respected the Jewish religion so much that he put his own money into the building of a synagogue there. And when we read of the things that Jesus did there, quite a number of His miracles took place here. He healed that centurion's servant, apparently, in Matthew 8:5. He healed Peter's mother-in-law in Peter's house, in Matthew 8:14 beginning. Then immediately after that it says that all day long they brought others to Jesus to be healed, both those who had illnesses and those who were demon-possessed. It was here that the story that was read to us at the beginning this morning took place in Mark chapter 2, where Jesus was teaching in the house. And while it doesn't identify specifically the house, some think it was Peter's house. Others think that Jesus probably took His own house to rent while He was living there. Whichever the case, it was filled with people as He was teaching them. So much so that these men who wanted their friend to be healed could not get in, so they climb up on the roof and tear it open and let the man down in front of Jesus. That's at Capernaum. And Jesus taught in the synagogue there. It was there, according to John chapter 6, that He actually delivered that great message of John 6 about Him being the bread of life. And where many decided not to follow Him that day. It was there on another occasion while He was teaching that there was a man who had an evil spirit, that He cast that evil spirit out there in the synagogue. Well, what is there today that we might see? When they first started excavating Capernaum, this is what the synagogue looked like about 1905. It had been destroyed apparently by that earthquake in 746 and whatever had been done since then mostly was people coming in to take the stone to carry to other places to build other buildings with. But now they have mostly reconstructed what they can of the synagogue. You can see it there in the background and the foreground, or the lower walls of some of the other parts of the town. We mostly focused on the synagogue while we were there. We had the opportunity to step inside of it and see how nice a place it was. And one thing we need to realize is this synagogue is not the one that was there in Jesus' day. This one, the scholars say, was built somewhere in the 300s or early 400s probably. And it quite a magnificent place. But if you look in this close-up picture I took of the foundation of the synagogue, you can see the white stone. And so that synagogue, the ruins of it there today, is called the White Synagogue. But the one below, the stones below, are the local basalt rock, of which everything around there normally was built. This is the foundation of the earlier synagogue. It probably had been destroyed by some earlier earthquake, and then in the 300s, when this white synagogue was built, they used exactly the same foundation and built on top of it. And so that is the foundation of the synagogue where Jesus taught. And this is the town where Jesus lived during his ministry. One of these houses may well have been the one those fellows tore the hole in the roof of to let their friend down in. Now you can see back in the background some other structure. That's actually a church building. It's a church building built upon piers so as not to disturb the archaeological remains that are beneath it. And that church building is built over the house that since the middle of the 1st century, since the AD 50s or 60, has been usually identified as Peter's house. If you go into the church building, it has a glass floor, so you can see the building beneath. We didn't go in. Instead, we just looked under. But you can see the most central part of that picture is what's left of the structure from the 1st century. Then later, an octagonal building was built around it in the probably the 200s to try to protect it, and it was a church, a Christian church. Then later, a bigger one built around that, and now at last, here in the late 20th century, they built a huge one over it to try to preserve this site. We had the opportunity, while we were there, since it was Sunday, to sit down under the trees right next to the synagogue and have a church service and have communion. And there was not a dry eye among us, as the one who was leading us talked about, that what we were about to do was to be done in remembrance of him. Because there we were sitting right next to the places where he had walked and taught and healed and called his disciples. And this made it real. This was not out of a storybook anymore. This was not some artist reconstruction of what the place might have looked like. This was the place. Dr. Long is an archaeologist, along with being dean of the Department of Biblical Studies over at Lubbock Christian University. And what he said rung true with everything I've read elsewhere, that scholars are 99% sure this is the foundation of that synagogue. And at least he says, concerning Peter's house, that they're at least 95% sure this is really Peter's house. And we're not saying this because we want to revere these places or make them holy places, but because these are real places. Then just one more. The Jordan River. One of the dominant, obviously, geographic features of this land. And while we could have done a lot of different things there, I just want to tell you briefly about one thing we did do. We went down just to where Jordan comes out of the Sea of Galilee. There's a place called Yardenit, or Yardenit. It's a place where they have built a facility where people who want to come to be baptized. Many pilgrims who come to Israel want to be baptized in the Jordan River, no matter what their previous experience with baptism is. And of our group, we had 9 who wanted to be baptized. Again, many of them have been Christians ever since they were teenagers, and now they're in their 70s. But they want to be baptized in the Jordan River. I was one of the ones that volunteered to do the baptizing. And here we are at the Jordan River baptismal place, and well set up and well designed. The water was kind of cold. I think it was probably between 65 and 70 degrees. We were able to rent robes to be baptized. And when we got down to the place where we were going to be baptized, we were making the arrangements. And over next to us was another group of people, about 8 people. And that one of their leaders came over to us and says, "Do y'all have someone to baptize? We're from Africa, and we came here to be baptized, but we didn't realize they didn't provide someone to baptize us." And so Dr. Long started talking to them and eventually teaching them, because all of them had been sprinkled as infants. And that's the only baptism they had ever known. And so we offered, and they accepted, to have them baptized along with their own people. And so began the process. Yes, that bald-headed fellow there's me. That's one of the men from Africa. They were from 3 different nations. I think 1 or 2 were from Malawi. There were some from Ghana and some from Kenya. I believe were the 3 nations that they represented. As we baptized them, it was a marvelous experience. I baptized 9 people that day. That's the most I've ever baptized in one day. And especially when the water's only 65 degrees. That's also rather shocking. But it was just an amazing, incredible time. And one of the men, I don't know that I've got a picture of him. Yes, that's him there. I'm just raising him up out of the water. When he came down to me to be baptized, I was explaining to him how I cover his nose with my hand and have my arm behind him. He said, no, I don't want you to cover my nose. He says, I want to be baptized all over. He said, and when you put me down in the water as far as you can. He said, because my sins, they are many. And they need to be washed away. And so we accommodated him. We're so thankful that we had the opportunity to do that. And so in conclusion, I'm running 5 minutes long here. I want you to not only have a lifelong desire to know the Bible and teach it, but I want you to have a lifelong desire to know the land of the Bible. To not only for yourself, but for all those who will hear you, to know that this is a real place, not just a storybook place. And if you have the opportunity to ever go there yourself, I encourage you to do that. But short of that, there are many, many resources that you can take advantage of that will help you and those you teach know that this is a real place where real people and a real God did real things, and where the ultimate reality took place for all of us. Thank you very much.